No one could have imagined that the man who used to be in hundreds of TV shows watched by millions of people around the world would one day be hunched over in fear inside the cold stone walls of a federal prison. But the truth is even worse than what the media ever said. Rick Harrison isn't just serving a life sentence for charges of money laundering and human trafficking. He's being abused by other prisoners who used to watch him on TV and now hate everything he stands for. Rick Harrison is a well-known and loved TV personality who has been physically and mentally abused while in prison. What made him a prime target in a prison system already known for its violence toward regular inmates? And the bigger question is whether fame really is a shield or whether it was the spark that started the constant punishment Harrison now faces every day. The dark side behind the spotlight for years, Rick Harrison kept up the image of a good father, a successful businessman, and a sharp-minded TV personality within. Rick has an uncanny knack for judging the value of antiques, but fame often brings shadows. In Rick's case, those shadows didn't go away. They were the shapes of an underground system he is now accused of building and running behind the scenes. The first people to suspect him weren't the media, but his former business partners and associates. Rumors about undocumented cash deals, imported items without the right paperwork, and vague investments that couldn't be tracked started circulating in Las Vegas business circles as early as 2016. At the time, each episode of Porn Stars drew over 5 million viewers on the History Channel. It was a huge hit, and no network wanted to look into one of its most bankable stars. That changed in 2017 when the FBI began a wider investigation into money laundering in Nevada's porn industry. Internal reports found that Las Vegas was one of the 5 U.S. cities with the most uncontrolled high-volume cash flow. High-profile businesses like Gold and Silver Porn Shop did transactions worth millions of dollars. Early investigations didn't directly name Rick, but by the middle of 2018, a series of fishy financial records were found in tax returns and bank accounts linked to his business. In late 2024, the FBI took action. They raided Rick's $3.7 million mansion before dawn and seized dozens of boxes of documents, hard drives, cash, and other papers related to alleged shell companies that were directly or indirectly linked to Rick. The news outlets CNN, Fox News, and TMZ all broke the story with headlines that people were shocked to learn that a famous porn star was being investigated for money laundering and trafficking people. The internet went crazy with images of Rick Harrison being handcuffed and led out of his home while cameras flashed. In April 2025, Rick Harrison was officially charged with money laundering conspiracy in a human trafficking ring and federal financial fraud. The charges said that Rick used his porn shop as a business front to launder money and commit fraud. Millions of dollars in illegal funds, some of which were linked to a multi-state human trafficking operation, were laundered. Crucially, digital evidence allegedly showed Rick's direct involvement in authorizing and organizing these transactions. At trial, Rick's lawyers said that he had been manipulated by trusted associates and couldn't keep an eye on every internal operation. But prosecutors showed a mountain of evidence, including emails, recorded calls, and signed contracts, that showed his active role in the criminal enterprise. People were shocked when Rick Harrison was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Others said he got what he deserved, but few saw what was coming next. The court case was over, but for Rick Harrison, the real sentence had just begun. In prison, he was no longer the star of a hit show and had lost all power and fame. He was just another inmate, and in that world, the punishment would go far beyond the law, including brutal physical and mental torture in a place where fame doesn't matter and survival is the only thing that matters. The first shock behind bars, not long after getting his life sentence, Rick Harrison was moved to a medium security federal prison in Nevada that housed over 200 inmates, including drug dealers, financial fraudsters, and murderers. With a crime record as bad as his and a name known across the country, Rick was impossible to ignore for both inmates and correctional staff. Ironically, the fame that once protected him in the media world had now become a double-edged sword that haunted him behind bars. From the first day Rick walked into prison, the atmosphere had changed. Gone were the studio lights, the cheers, and the autograph-seeking fans. In their place were the cold, measuring stares of hardened inmates, men who had been thrown out of society and were now seeing one of its most famous faces. His arrival was like fresh meat being dropped into a cage, an unexpected prize for those who wanted to humiliate, dominate, or use him as leverage in the prison's harsh social structure. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, up to 18% of famous prisoners are nearly 4 times as many inmates as the average are physically attacked in their first year. For Rick, that number wasn't just a number. It was a threat he could feel every time he left his cell. At first, he tried to stay low, no eye contact, no conversations, following the rules exactly as they were written. But in prison, silence isn't neutrality, it's weakness, and weakness is never forgiven. The guards who were used to dealing with famous prisoners didn't treat him any differently. In fact, some of them were more hostile. One person reportedly said during roll call, "Don't think being on TV gets you a pass here. In here, you're 98,416, nothing more." This lack of concern created a dangerous void. No one was looking out for Rick. In a place where the rules are written in blood and fists, being alone is fatal. Within the first week, Rick received 3 indirect threats. A wet towel was thrown into his cell, a broken razor was thrown into his cell, and someone put a knife next to his bed with a note that said, "Holly, wood don't survive here." No one claimed responsibility, but the message was clear. He wasn't welcome, and one wrong move could cost him a lot. He became the focus of constant attention, not just from one group, but from almost everyone. He was talked about in the hallways, stared down in the mess hall, and often skipped over in the meal line. His mental state quickly changed. He was used to leading teams and making decisions on the spot. Rick could no longer hold someone's gaze for more than 3 seconds while performing on camera. Sleep didn't help. He'd wake up to the sound of evil laughter, tapping on his door, or just the unsettling feeling of being watched. In a place where every movement can be seen as a threat, Rick started to lose his normal calm. The violence hadn't come in the form of blows, but in the form of silence, glares of disdain, and being alone with no one to turn to. Every night he would end the day with the same question: will I make it through tomorrow? This kind of long-term humiliation is a common start to physical assaults in prison. In fact, 70% of violent assaults happen after 1 to 3 weeks of verbal and psychological abuse. Rick was exactly following this pattern, and he knew it. What was worse was that no one wanted to help, and there was no way out. The breaking down had started not with fists, but with words. Rick Harrison used to be in charge of all negotiations, but now he couldn't even negotiate with his own fear. 3. The first attack happened about 3 weeks after Rick Harrison got into prison. It happened on a hot June afternoon during yard time, when inmates could get some fresh air, exercise, or socialize, with only a few guards watching. The yard was wide open, but no one was out of sight. It wasn't just a place to stretch, it was an underground. Rick went outside as usual. He sat down on a quiet spot next to an old concrete bench next to the barbed wire fence, away from the groups of inmates who were lifting weights, smoking, or playing basketball. But that day was different. A group of 4 men, all veteran inmates from Cell Block C, started walking toward him. Leading them was a tall, heavily tattooed white man called Vince, who was known around the prison as the Enforcer. "Hey TV boss up," Vince said in a quiet voice. "You used to sell garbage on TV and make millions, so why are you curled up like a scared rat now?" Rick didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the ground to stay calm, but Vince wasn't done yet. He walked up to Rick, put his hand on his shoulder, and leaned in. "Here you're nobody, you're leftovers." Without waiting for a response, Vince pushed Rick to the ground, and the group laughed quietly. Then Vince gave Rick a hard punch to the face. There was silence in the yard, and Rick Harrison was jumped for the first time in his life. In less than a minute, the group left like nothing had happened. Rick lay there with his face swollen and his lips split, and blood was seeping from the corner of his mouth. No one came to help. It wasn't until the yard bell rang that an older prisoner quietly led Rick to the hospital, where a prison medic cleaned him up, wrapped his ribs, and gave him 2 painkillers. No report was made. It was just seen as a minor incident, but for Rick, that beating was the beginning of the end. It was the first time he felt truly helpless. There were no rules, no protection, and no justice. Just the truth. A man who used to have everything now had nothing here. In the days that followed, Rick began to understand the harsh order of prison life. There was no such thing as neutrality. And since Rick didn't belong to any side, he was now a free target. Then Frank came along. Frank had been in prison for over 18 years. He didn't hit Rick, he made an offer. One afternoon in the cafeteria, he sat down next to him and said, "I can protect you, but you need to have value." Rick looked confused and asked, "What do you mean?" Frank smiled. "You had connections, you knew how to move money, you knew how to make people believe you. That's stuff that matters in here, but you've got to pick a side or you'll get picked apart." It wasn't kindness, it was survival. Rick knew that refusing meant being hunted forever, but agreeing meant he gave up the last of his pride by joining an illegal internal economy that moved drugs, laundered money, bribed guards, and managed services that inmates relied on. Rick agreed, but he knew it was a surrender. He became a scribe, writing deals between groups and using his mind to do math for criminals. In exchange, he was protected from beatings and direct threats, but he was now looked down upon. They didn't hit him, but they didn't respect him either. People no longer admired him as a TV star. Instead, they saw him as a desperate man looking for safety from killers. Rick stopped trusting anyone. In his cell, he wrote notes in the margins of a Bible like private confessions. "I made mistakes, but do I deserve this?" He pulled away from almost everything, only spoke when necessary, avoided eye contact, and became hypervigilant. But that only made him a target for a different kind of torture. Psychological erosion. He didn't need to be hit. As he walked by, someone would snidely say, "Where's your camera crew now?" or "What's up with the reality show?" While he washed dishes, the snide comments, the stares, and the sarcastic whistles wore him down. He became paranoid and couldn't sleep. He had nightmares about being dragged into the yard and executed. He'd wake up drenched in sweat and with a racing heart, but unable to tell anyone. The prison had a mental health program for depressed inmates, but Rick never signed up. He was afraid that it would make people see him as weak. And in prison, weakness is a death sentence. According to the National Institute of Corrections, prisoners who are subjected to long-term psychological abuse rather than physical abuse are 3 times more likely to develop severe anxiety disorders. Rick was becoming the perfect example of this. His mind wasn't breaking from beatings, it was breaking from constant humiliation, surveillance, and the slow loss of identity. The world no longer saw Rick Harrison as a TV mogul. He was in prison, that's the worst part. He was starting to believe it. For the second beating, in his 3rd month in prison, Rick Harrison moved from adapting to a new phase of total collapse. He had picked a side and agreed to act as a go-between for Frank's crew, so he thought he was safe. But in prison, alliances don't last, and being on the wrong side can be a slow-motion death sentence. It all started with a failed deal to hide a shipment of illegal tobacco into the laundry room didn't get where it was supposed to go, and the inmate who did it was caught red-handed by a guard. Word quickly spread across the yard that someone had snitched, and Rick's name was whispered as the first suspect. In a world where silence is often a sign of betrayal, Rick became the main suspect. Rick could feel the change in energy. The men who used to protect him now looked away. Frank avoided eye contact, and the two henchmen who used to sit with him at lunch stopped showing up. There were no warnings or protection for Rick, which was the clearest sign of all. He was left to fend for himself. The attack happened on a Wednesday during lunch break, when prisoners were free to move between the yard and common areas. Rick walked alone with his small notebook, heading to his usual spot in the far corner of the yard. This time, however, no one else was there. There were no groups or chatter. The eerie silence, like in an old mob movie before a hit, was the first thing that told Rick something was wrong. 3 men came out from behind a small utility shed at the far end of the yard. One of them was Vince, the man who had attacked Rick during his first week. But this time he wasn't with his old crew. The other 2 were Latino inmates who were thought to be part of a rival group to Frank's. When opposing crews work together in prison, it usually means one thing: the target has been marked and no one is coming to defend him. Rick turned to head back toward the building when Vince called out, "Where are you?" "We had an appointment in Hollywood." So before Rick could answer, they rushed him and hit him in the jaw with a hook. They then hit him in the ribs with a boot, and one man grabbed his hair and slammed his head into the pavement. Blood dripped from his temple, but he didn't scream or fight. He had lost all of his strength and will to live. He had to give up. The beating only lasted a minute, but it broke 2 ribs, a cheekbone, and his right leg was dislocated. When the guards finally ran away, he was badly hurt. The attackers didn't try to hide. They didn't need to. They knew there wouldn't be an investigation, and they were right. The incident was recorded as an altercation between prisoners and was handled internally. Rick was moved to a different cell and taken to the hospital, this time with visible internal injuries, but the worst damage, which an MRI can't see, was inside. For 3 days, Rick wouldn't talk, eat, or go to therapy. A prison psychologist visited, but Rick turned his face to the wall at one point. Heard him whisper, "I don't even know who I am anymore." These were the first signs of major depressive disorder. Denial: he couldn't believe he was once loved by millions of people. Anger not at his attackers, but at himself for letting it all happen. And hopelessness: he started to wonder out loud, would anyone even care if I died? Along with the depression came haunting images. Rick started dreaming over and over again of the old things he used to value, but now they were in terrible shape. Watch face, smashed statues, beheaded statues of joy and purpose that had been taken away. What haunted him more was the feeling of betrayal from everyone he had helped, not just Frank, the guards, or his lawyers. He wasn't mad at them, but at himself for believing in them in the first place. Isolation became his habit. He stopped talking and wouldn't leave his cell unless he was forced to. He'd sit for hours staring through the bars at the same spot of yard where he had been beaten like a dog. According to a report by the American Psychological Association, 42% of prisoners who experience both psychological isolation and physical abuse experience identity collapse within 6 months. Rick fit the bill perfectly. He had been in charge of his image but now had no control over it and couldn't define who he was. The torture wasn't just physical, it went deep into his nervous system. Rick started to feel lost when he filled out a health form and wrote his own name wrong. Another time, he went to the wrong housing unit after being called in for a checkup. The prison doctor said these were classic signs of PTSD, which is triggered by extreme and long-lasting fear. When asked if he wanted to switch prisons, Rick said no. His answer was simple: it's the same everywhere. But to the people who were watching him, that sentence said it all. It showed that Rick Harrison no longer believed in any system, inside or out. 500-year-old Japanese katana on national television could no longer deal with his own feelings. He had lost control of his environment, his will to fight, and most tragically, his sense of self. 5. Why did Rick Harrison really fall? Harrison's downfall wasn't just a series of legal problems or 2 brutal beatings in prison. It was the inevitable crash of a system built on long-standing, deeply flawed beliefs about his lifestyle, how he thought about himself and his place in society. To understand how a man who once at the top of fame, now at the bottom of life, we need to look at 3 important factors: the weight of fame, ambition without limits, and the illusion of immunity, a mental condition that many famous people experience. Rick Harrison wasn't just a famous businessman. For over a decade, he was a familiar face on American TV, representing the idealized working-class American dream and the self-made success story. Porn Stars became one of the most popular reality shows on the Rick wasn't just the face of the gold and silver porn shop. He represented the idea that intelligence and hard work could lead to success. That's why his fame wasn't just an asset. It was a kind of halo that made him stand out as soon as he got to prison. To other prisoners, Rick wasn't just another prisoner. He was the personification of everything they'd been denied: money, power, and admiration. This made him the perfect role model. Fame is a double-edged sword. In the free world, it brings sponsorships, business opportunities, and public respect. In prison, it makes you pray that Rick didn't understand that. He went to prison hoping to stay out of the spotlight, but his fame made that impossible. Like a domino effect, every punch and sneer was a way for the system to punish a famous person who dared to walk into the world of the forgotten. It's also true that Rick Harrison was a smart businessman. But as his empire grew, his ambition crossed the line into illegal and unethical behavior. According to the investigation, Rick ran or had ties to at least 9 other businesses besides his porn shop, with large amounts of money flowing through anonymous offshore accounts. Using the porn shop as a front for laundering money and allegedly helping with human trafficking wasn't just a case of bad judgment or misplaced trust, as his lawyers once said. Rich people often think, "I'm smart enough to beat the system, I'm the exception." Ambition isn't bad in and of itself, but when it's not limited by ethics or the law, it turns into a form of self-granted authority. Rick wasn't the only one who thought this way. CEO like Elizabeth Holmes in the Ronos and celebrities like Lori Laughlin in the college admissions scandal all think that their success protects them from consequences. Rick thought he could run a criminal underworld without getting caught, but there is no such thing as safe in the underworld. One slip led to an arrest, and the whole operation fell apart like a house of cards, and he didn't just think he could get away with it. He also thought that his fame would protect him in prison. This is one of the most dangerous illusions that celebrities who fall from fame have. They think they'll be treated differently even when they're locked up, and they expect to be given special treatment. Federal prison doesn't care if you were loved on TV. It's full of lifers who have given up on status. To them, Rick wasn't that guy from Porn Stars. He was fresh meat, a name to bring down, a symbol to crush in order to climb higher. Rick's identity, death, being beaten, left alone, and reduced to a ghost, was the result of someone who had never learned how to live at the bottom. That illusion not only left him open to harm, it also made it take longer for him to get used to the harsh social rules of prison. Rick went into prison with the same cautious distance he used as a public figure. But in prison, being neutral is deadly. If you don't pick a side, you become the target. Rick didn't build any real loyalty, and when things got bad, even Frank's crew let him go because they saw Rick's only value as his fame. And in a world built on blood, fame doesn't buy survival. 6. living like a ghost. The unraveling of a man after 2 violent assaults and months of living in a state of constant fear. Rick Harrison wasn't himself anymore. Anyone who had seen him on TV, with his straight back, firm voice, and signature confidence, wouldn't recognize the figure now drifting silently through the halls of Cell Block 4. Rick's shoulders were slumped, and his eyes were hollow. He didn't notice the world around him. He was just breathing shadow. He moved like a machine, wake up, eat, go to medical checkups, and return to his cell without talking, writing, reading, or responding. Guards gave him a nickname. A new guard once said, "Is that old guy deaf or something?" And an old guard replied, "No, he's just waiting for time to do the rest." No one hit Rick physically anymore, but they didn't need to. The final blow didn't come from fists. It came from within. Rick Harrison had given up all attempts to keep his pride, identity, and any semblance of the respected person he used to be. Prison didn't just lock him up. It crushed his will, and in Rick's case, that surrender was complete. Yale Law School's Prison Project describes this state as when someone loses the ability to identify themselves. They live in passive detachment and don't have a goal or a framework for interpreting reality. Rick checked every box. He didn't exist with hope. He existed because there was nothing else left. Once, a young guard saw Rick sitting still by a window and asked, "What are you thinking about?" Rick didn't answer at first. After a long pause, he looked up and said, "I used to think prison was where people went to die. Now I'm not even sure what I'm paying for anymore." Rick Harrison said. No one answered because they couldn't. In that dim corner of the prison, Rick Harrison was no longer a former TV star, a businessman, a victim, or even a prisoner. He had become something else entirely. A person without any motivation living inside the hollow shell of a man who used to be strong. And that is the cruelest form of torture. When someone is robbed of the ability to feel human at all, when the name Rick Harrison comes up. When people hear the name Rick, they don't think of a smart businessman or a TV star with a sly grin behind a pawn shop counter. Instead, they think of a man who was broken not only by the legal system, but also by something much worse, the collapse from within. From being hailed as a symbol of the American dream to fame, scandal, crime, imprisonment, violence, and finally oblivion, Rick went through a lot. But what makes his story truly haunting isn't the life sentence. It's the slow erosion of few could have imagined what would happen to a man who was once famous and looked up to by everyone. He was tortured into losing his very sense of self, which is not something anyone could have imagined. From a sociological point of view, Rick Harrison's story shows that fame doesn't protect you from consequences, and it definitely doesn't protect you from yourself. Fame can open doors, ink deals, and applause, but it can also turn you into a lightning rod for anger, envy, and violence. Rick used to think he could bargain for anything from the price of an antique to his own freedom. But in prison, there are no bargaining chips, no cameras, and no cheering crowds. There is only the cold reality. Fame is a sharp blade, and if you use it carelessly, it cuts the hand that holds it. More than just a personal tragedy, this story is a warning to anyone who is blindly chasing fame, wealth, and power without understanding the price. Because once you cross a certain point, in the end, you don't just lose your freedom or image, you lose yourself as well. And by the time you realize it, you might not be whole enough to go back. If this truth hit home, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories that show how harsh reality can be.